The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
Struggles aplenty for the American people, but can all the blame be laid squarely at the feet of President Joe Biden? Is he the man who's leading the charge towards constitutional destruction, or merely the poor guy who left the front door open by mistake? As Bob Dylan sang, the times they are a-changing. Will those with liberty in their hearts, blood and minds sink like stones or learn to swim in the treacherous new waters? Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's show, we're going to delve deep into the Virginia election results, figure out what's going on with Biden's polling numbers, and a whole lot more. I'd like to say a special hello to our listeners in Brownswood, Texas on KXYL 1240 AM and 102.3 FM. Thanks for being part of the team. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Let's get started. With a stunning upset for Joe Biden, and more so Terry McAuliffe in the Virginia gubernatorial race, shockwaves have been sent through the Democratic Party establishment. Was Joe Biden a drag on the voting? Was Donald Trump a boost? And how can Dems reposition themselves for a resurgence in 2022, if they can at all? Well, to answer these questions and more, we're joined by longtime host of this here Liberty Nation Radio and senior political analyst for LibertyNation.com, not to mention former senatorial candidate for Old Dominion and Virginia resident, Mr. Tim Donner. Welcome back to the show, Tim.
Always a pleasure, Mark.
So, Tim, you're one of the few voices who steadfastly predicted a Glenn Youngkin win. What gave you the confidence in that for such a bold position?
Well, I felt from the beginning that Youngkin essentially came from outside the failed GOP establishment in Virginia that hadn't won a statewide race in about a decade. He seemed to be pitch perfect for the time. They needed somebody from outside the political establishment, but someone who didn't remind the voters of Donald Trump. Youngkin took the policies of Trump to a large extent without the Trump personality, and he cashed in on the alignment of the stars. The answer to your questions in the opening, did Biden contribute to this loss? Of course he did. And the confusion about the president was one of the things that McAuliffe blew in a way that people couldn't understand. Terry McAuliffe is the quintessential political operative veteran career politician, and he made incredible mistakes, including saying that Biden was unpopular in Virginia, and then saying because of that he didn't want to invite him, and then in desperation did invite him, which was an inexplicable move. So I think really, Mark, the stars aligned perfectly for a Youngkin victory.
Yeah, he walked the line very much between aligning himself to Trump the man and Trump the movement, which I think is a large distinction that kept a lot of the more negative media outlets off his back with that. Now, as Kamala Harris warned, what happens in Virginia will in large part determine what happens in 2022 and 2024 and on, so she said. It seems to me that this prognostication by the vice president will have the Democratic operatives aflutter. Now that they've had a little time for the dust to settle, what kind of strategies do you think they'll be looking at? And was Kamala Harris's prediction here, is it all but certain?
I might rephrase what she said to what happens in Virginia does not stay in Virginia. In other words, you look at what's happened in New Jersey, and I think also the overlooked question on the ballot in Minneapolis, where the voters rejected an alternative to the police by a large margin, 57 to 43, they said, no, we want to keep the police. And of course, Minneapolis was ground zero for the Black Lives Matter deconstructionist movement.
The Summer of Love, I believe, is the
Summer of Love
for it.
There were a lot of turnarounds in this race that was all about culture wars. Although in the end, it turns out taxes and the economy were extremely important in the minds of voters. But the most curious turnaround was white women, who, of course, famously suburban white women, put Joe Biden into office. And now they took Terry McAuliffe out of office because there was like a 12-point swing in the votes of white women.
15%, I think.
It was a 15% swing. So that was very significant. But Kamala Harris, what happens in Virginia is not going to stay in Virginia. And, Kamala Harris has a knack for saying just the wrong thing at exactly the wrong time. And now that is going to come back to haunt her. And for the Democrats, what do they do now with this huge reconciliation bill? And not to mention the bipartisan infrastructure bill. I imagine they're going to pass the infrastructure bipartisan bill fast to give them something for the voters to feel okay about the Democrats about. But that huge reconciliation bill, they'd be better off dropping it, because if they try to pass that now that they've been rebuked across the country, bad idea.
Education and what schools should be teaching, and by extension, how much input parents should have. That was one of the key factors, along with the economy, as you rightly pointed out, to Youngkin's victory. Now, that was a local issue initially that soon became a national focal point, or a touch paper, if you will. So do you see Republicans going forward, and I suppose even some more moderate Democrats, running on a similar platform? Do you think they've seen that as a key to potential electoral success?
Well, I think there's no question about it, because we're in the midst of a cultural civil war in this country.
Not according to Barack Obama.
No, of course not. But even Barack Obama flying in to try and save Terry McAuliffe didn't work. And by the way, he's the only one of the people that got flown in for McAuliffe's benefit that's actually still popular. Biden isn't, Kamala Harris isn't, Hillary Clinton isn't. She didn't come into the state, but she did she did a lot of mailers. She did a lot of mailers
to get out of
yeah. But the culture wars are on. And I'll tell you what, the Democrats benefited from the pandemic to a degree that's almost inconceivable in jamming Joe Biden somehow into the Oval Office. But what they didn't realize is they took advantage of the pandemic with the voting laws and all of that, was that parents, because of the pandemic, were able to see what their kids were being taught, because they were forced to be home. The parents were, to a large degree, horrified by what they saw, and that's why we're in a culture war. That's why 3 times as many people are now being homeschooled in the Black community, for example. So, the chickens are coming home to roost from the pandemic in terms of the Democrats being able to exploit that virus for their own political purposes. Now the Republicans are able to do the same.
Yeah, once you pull back that curtain, the wizard never quite looks the same.
That's true.
I don't think many people really understand the full implications of this contest, or at least it's not being touted in the mainstream media. Because Virginia used to be considered a bellwether race, one of the most important. And it seems to me that status is now back on the table, and that doesn't bode well for Democrats. What's your analysis on this?
Well, it's remarkable. When I first moved to Virginia some 35 years ago, it was bright red. Then it began to turn purple in the days of Barack Obama, and then became actually deep blue to the point where the governor, both senators, lieutenant governor, attorney general, 7 out of 11 Congress members of Congress were all Democrats. So with Youngkin turning it over, plus the AG and the Black woman that won the lieutenant governor race as a Republican, this is a a complete transformation of the Virginia government. And this is a state that had started to move left and now has jammed the brakes on hard, like they are coming up on a stationary car in front of them going 55 miles an hour, and all of a sudden have to jam on the brakes. That's what happened to the Democrats in Virginia. And look, again, you look at New Jersey as another example, a race that was supposed to be an easy slam dunk for the Democrat turned into a battle for the ages, and the Democrats are shaking in their boots, Mark, shaking in their boots, because there's not a whole lot of prospect of it getting better for them in the next year before midterm elections.
Okay, final question for you, Tim. A nice, quick, short-fire answer here. We know what this means for Republicans going forward, but what does it mean for Joe Biden's presidency and his reputation with his congressional members?
I think he's going to be left with his pen and his phone after the 2022 midterms. And I think government is going to be at a standstill because I believe Republicans will win the Senate and the House, and it will leave Joe Biden isolated and alone and ineffectual in the White House.
A lame duck president after the very first term. That's quite an achievement for anybody.
He's almost won already, Mark, because I think the party, if they're smart, need to do a reverse of Clinton and triangulate and disassociate themselves from the failures of their president the way Clinton disassociated himself from the Congress in order to gain re-election in 1996.
Tim Donner, thank you ever so much.
Always a pleasure, Mark.
Now don't go anywhere. Later in the show, we'll be talking about Fourth Amendment rights in our special Talking Liberty segment. But before that, after this short break, we'll be back with Jeff Charles to examine the ever-shrinking approval numbers of President Joe Biden.
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
In the words of the Limbo Kings, how low can you go? Well, that's a question Democrats and their supporters in the Fourth Estate must be asking themselves of President Biden's approval ratings. Not only is Biden heavily unfavored to run again in 2024 by his own party, but it also seems that on just about every issue of importance, the so-called kitchen table issues, Democrats are pacing well behind the GOP in who can handle them best. So what are the latest figures and what's behind this precipitous decline? Well, we're joined by author and podcaster, Mr. Jeff Charles, to find those oft-elusive root causes. Thanks for being here, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So what are the latest figures for Joe Biden, Jeff? And does the trend suggest that they're going to get better or worse?
It's not looking good for him, Mark. Right now, the latest NBC News poll has his approval rating at a dismal 42%. His disapproval is at 54%. And to give a comparison, these are Trump-like numbers because Trump was at the same place during his presidency. The difference, though, is that Trump didn't enjoy the protection of the media and the media's willingness to cover up for a lot of the things that he's mishandled. I think this is about as good as it's going to get for Biden. I don't see his numbers going up very significantly, if at all. And I think it's possible that they will even get worse because even in the past, there were polls showing him at like 38 or 39%. I think this is where it's going to sit for a while.
Okay, but it's not just Joe Biden, though, is it? Democrats, when compared to the GOP, they're falling behind on just about every major issue, from COVID, dealing with COVID, to schools, to the all-important economy questions. Now, how is this possible when the Democrats, they control the executive and legislative branches?
Well, it's because even though they control both chambers of Congress and the White House, they're not getting anything done. I mean, they are in desperate need of a win, and they're just not getting it now. That same NBC News poll also showed that 7 in 10 adults, that's 70%, including almost half of Democrats, believe that the nation is headed in the wrong direction. So this is a bad mark for Biden, but also for Democrats in general. I mean, they haven't passed any significant legislation since the coronavirus relief bill. And on other issues, they're polling badly. Like critical race theory is not polling well. As far as vaccine mandates, that's more of a mixed bag. Some are showing that the majority of Americans favor them, but even the ones that show that Americans favor vaccine mandates, it's a thin margin. It's not overwhelming. When it comes to the economy and the migrant crisis, he's pulled horribly on this. Most people think that he has mishandled pretty much any problem this administration has been presented with, they have mishandled. So these numbers are not surprising.
Yeah, Biden's become a real crisis magnet, as we call it, over on this side of the pond. Now, I think many people, they see a disconnect between what the ruling party wants and what the actual voters want. So people voted for Joe Biden based on his immigration strategies, and this has gone topsy-turvy. It's gone completely wrong. They voted for him on his economic strategy, and it's gone completely wrong. And this has been equally true for Republicans in the past. So why is it that politicians and political parties, they just can't seem to deliver what they were voted in on?
You know, it's really sad, Mark, because I think what happens is that not all of them, but a lot of these people get into Congress or get into a position of leadership, and they're in there because they want to save the world. They want to save the country. They have good intentions, but then the swamp comes a-calling. And they start getting that influence, and the temptation is strong to just go along with what the party wants. I mean, if you look at what's happening with Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, people like them, they're standing on principles. Whether you agree with them or not, they're standing on principles, and look at how the party is treating them. But Manchin and Sinema are trying to represent the interests of their constituents. Unfortunately, we have lost a lot of that. And it's not just Democrats, it happens on the Republican side too. There are very few principled lawmakers in Congress because of the influence of the swamp and the parties that have their own agenda that doesn't necessarily reflect what their constituents are voting on.
Well, speaking of Congress, the congressional elections, which we often call the midterms, they're just a year away. Now, what can Joe Biden and his party do to stave off the almost certain defeat that they're facing? Or is it just the repetitive tides of history that mean they're going to lose the majorities? And there's really not much they can do at all. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, the odds are not in their favor, Mark. And at this point, I don't think that there is anything that they can do. I've been saying that the only possible way is if they get a win like right now. It's going to be like if they get a major win and it's, a few months to the midterms, they're still going to lose. They need to be able to go to the constituents and say, hey, this is what we got done. Keep us in office and we'll do more.
Jeff, I'm interested in the media angle here. So as you mentioned earlier, they're very much protective. They've built a protective fence around Joe Biden. And for the last 10 months, it's been a case of either look the other way or deflect or distract when Biden adds yet another crisis to his repertoire. But the cracks, they are starting to show. So how do you think the Fourth Estate will justify their previous coverage?
They're not going to justify it at all. They're just going to keep doing what they're doing. They don't care what we think. I mean, they have an agenda and they're going to push it. The only time the media has actually done their job under this administration was with the Afghanistan withdrawal and a little bit with the migrant crisis. I'll give them that. They were complaining about Biden not being transparent. But other than that, I mean, the media, for all intents and purposes, are the Ministry of Propaganda for the Democratic Party. So they're going to keep doing what they're doing.
Ministry of Propaganda indeed. Jeff Charles, thank you ever so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio, heard across the Radio America network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. And remember, you can tune in for Liberty Nation from 2 to 3 p.m. Sunday on KBKW, 103.5 FM and 1450 AM, the talk of Grays Harbor. Coming up soon on the show, we'll be discussing the latest cases that impact your liberty. But next up, we're going to figure out just how much cash Biden's climate change promises will cost you. Don't touch that dial.
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear. for your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
The president represented the United States at COP26, the uber elite climate conference hosted in Scotland this week. And it hasn't gone too well, from falling asleep on camera to vague commitments to spending all of your hard-earned dollars. One wonders just what impact this globalist charade will have on real working folks. Well, to help us crunch those costs, we're joined once again by author and economist, Mr. Andrew Moran. Welcome back to the show, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
So tell me, was this conference, was it a genuine effort to solve a problem? Or was it all just theatrics to justify increased taxation and big state regulation?
Well, I think everything, all these global summits are nothing but theatrics, whether it's the UN General Assembly or the COP26 or the Paris Accord, it's all just theatrics. I think two of the best signs to support my supposition that it was all nonsense was first, the way the media leaders described it. They described this whole event as the last chance to stop the climate emergency. If we don't spend all this money, then the world's going to end. And then the second sign was when President Biden, he fell asleep. I think that was a good sign too. But I can't fault the guy. I can't fault the guy for falling asleep. I would have fallen asleep too. If you read any of the transcripts of any of these officials who spoke, and I couldn't watch it because my eyes would be stuck in the back of my head because from rolling it all the time. But if you read the transcript, it was all the same poppycock. It was transformative action, climate crisis, only spending can reverse climate change. So yeah, it's all theatrics, and it's the same song and dance they tap to every single time on their private jets, spending millions of dollars. You know, I think it was the UK that had to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to host this event, and of
course they'll make that back through taxing British citizens, which is, of course, the noble way to do it.
If I wait one thing though, it was funny because they're saying how smaller countries can't host these events anymore because of how expensive they've become. So what the heck is that?
Yeah, Joe Biden riding an 85-car motorcade around Rome and then hopping on a private jet to attend a climate conference. The message is below the surface on this. Now, these commitments that the leaders of, I guess, 120 odd nations that they're making on behalf of their people, is it really just a case of taking money from poor people in rich countries and giving it to rich people in poor countries? Because to me, that's really what it seems like.
Well, I think that happens both on the domestic front and the international front. So if you have this, let's say the Build Back Better agenda, I think $600 billion of that, which is probably going to be $12 trillion of that, of the climate change component, that's a wealth transfer from the poor and middle class to the well-connected to the wealthy, because you're just taxing those people, whether it's subsidies and you're giving it to, you know, these cronyists. And then on the international level, yeah, you're absolutely correct. Many of these impoverished countries, they're poor for a reason. They have all these corrupt governments. They have the private sector that's cozy with these other corrupt officials, and then the policies they enact achieve absolutely nothing. So they say that all this money that they're giving to these poor countries, say that strings are attached to these funds. But once again, that's poppycock. Other nations, you know, what other nation is going to say, let's say Ethiopia, they're going to say, oh, you know, you have to pay this money back because you haven't achieved any of the climate change targets. That is not going to happen at all.
Yeah, this COP26 is being billed as the most significant environmental conference since the 2015 Paris Accords. Now, the Fourth Estate gives much kudos to the Paris Accords, but to my understanding, it's, as you just pointed out here, it's all a bit of a sham, isn't it? I mean, the Accords only mean that countries have to provide a goal for where they want to be in the future and report their progress towards it. And that's about it. That's all they have to do to be widely lauded by the world's international press. There's no teeth to it. There's no repercussions, as you just pointed out. And as we've seen with China, there's no fallout whatsoever if you decide you were too optimistic and then you're shifting back to coal-fired power stations for the next 10 years just to make sure. Now, is COP26, that's just more of the same, right?
Yeah, it is too. And if you look at the data, let's say you look at the U.S. Emissions data from when they left the Paris Accord. The U.S. is one of the few, perhaps even the only developed country to see a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions compared to all the other signatories of the Paris Accord. But in the end, I mean, as long as you tell all these developed countries what they want to hear, your little poor old country is going to get its hands on this nice chunk of change. And these countries admit it too. If you read or watch the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, he was saying that too. He was saying, okay, fine, we depend on coal right now. We have to produce coal because our country's running out of power. We need our people to survive. But if you want us to go adopt this green economy, then you have to give us money. You have to give us all this cash so we can mitigate this climate crisis. And of course, India's energy sector is quasi-state run. A lot of its companies are owned directly by the government. Others are, chiefly regulated by the government, so it's quasi. And these executives, these bureaucrats, these politicians, they're going to divvy up these payments and start counting their rupees. But at the same time, India wants its cake and eat it too. On the one hand, they'll say they want the money. And on the other, they say, okay, fine, we'll become net zero, but we're going to do it in the year 2070. And of course, Modi's not going to be around in the next 50 years. So these are just empty promises. Nobody's going to be held accountable whatsoever for this nonsense.
Well, let's dig into these numbers a little bit, Andrew. How much is this grand parade going to cost the average American taxpayer?
Yeah, well, so the Build Back Better agenda, that of course, is $600 billion. So you divvy that up, that's gonna be. Hang
on, hold the horse there, Andrew. Yeah, I thought it was zero cost.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you look at that regard, if you want to dive deeper into the monetary aspect of it, that's going to create massive waves of inflation. So that's going to directly cost U.S. taxpayers. When it comes to this whole COP26, I think the price tag is $100 billion to give to these poor countries. U.S. is throwing in about $20 billion of that. So once again, the U.S. taxpayers are going to be responsible for that. But I think it's not so much of a financial cost more than it is a societal issue, because if the real problem right now with going green and adopting all these green technologies, look what happened in Texas. 20% of its power grid was based on renewables. You look at what's happening in England. England has 45% of its power from renewables, but they had the least windy summer in the last 60 years. So that was another issue. So many countries in Asia.
Fortunately, Britain has Russia not too far away to rely on to send gas and fuel.
Yeah, hold on. But no, my last point though, and all these other countries, in Asia and Europe, they're suffering through these rolling power outages, and you see the correlation that they've invested heavily in the green renewables and green energy technology. So they're going to need more oil and gas, and everyone is finally starting to realize that. Okay, fine. Oil and gas, it's going to be here. These carbon zero goals are not realistic. I think it was the IEA who said, yeah, by the year 2050, oil and gas still can account for about a third of all energy output. So this whole, this fairies and lollipops is just not achievable at all. It's just these people want to go on there and, have sunshine and lollipops and spend millions of dollars doing it.
Yeah, now, we hear a lot about these emissions, climate issues. We hear about world hunger and any number of other catastrophes that are awaiting the human race. And so far, the solution from world leaders has always been more government, more taxes, and more spending. Now, tell me, Andrew, I'm reasonably sure I know your answer to this, but are these things, are they better left to the free markets to solve?
But you forgot one thing. You forgot about the printing. That's their other mechanism.
Yes, the free money.
I think the free market does a much better job than the government ever could on whether it's the environment or fighting global warming, whatever the case. You see a lot of innovation going on in the private sector. A lot of free enterprise developing these great technologies. Whether it's carbon vacuuming, a lot of Wall Street investment funds are investing in companies that are doing this. You're having a lot of entrepreneurs developing technologies to help get rid of plastic in the ocean. So what the government does is that they have all this waste, they have all this malinvestment, they misdirect the resources where it could be achieved more. There's a great environmentalist. He's a more of a realistic environmentalist. His name's Lundberg. He's Danish, and he was talking about instead of having these vast conferences, instead of putting all this money into these cronious green companies, you're better off just putting all this money into research and development as opposed to these padding these fat salaries in these green companies. I wrote a couple of years ago talking about this massive bubble that's occurred in the ESG realm, and I also wrote about it. I did a Swamponomics TV video about it, and the problem with that is that, yeah, sure, the Wall Street and the private sector, they're getting involved in climate change. The issue is that the government has distorted it so much, whereby anything that's labeled green will obviously get all these subsidies. So Wall Street's new mantra is, fossil fuel is bad, green is good. But at the same time, they're abandoning any sort of semblance of due diligence and necessary research to, find the right company, find the right technology, because they just want to find, you're green, you get $1 billion. You're green, you get $1 million without doing anything. So that's going to hurt any sort of, climate change efforts or these companies that want to solve the issue.
As Oliver Stone's Gordon Gekko might have said, green is good. Andrew Moran, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Right after this short break, we're talking liberty with Scott Cosenza. Is a simple plastic bag enough of a reason to violate your privacy? We'll be right back with Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network.
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
We're here with Scott D. Cosenza for our weekly Talking Liberty segment. Welcome back, Scott.
Hi, Mark.
Now, Scott, it's all happening with Kyle Rittenhouse, who's in court this week. Let's talk a little bit about the pretrial stuff, things that the judge says that the prosecution and the defense can say and can't say. And this is very interesting to me, that language is being guided by the judge. What's the take here?
Mark, Judge Schrader, the judge in the trial, has a policy in his courtroom, and it is not a statewide policy. It's his policy that the person who is the decedent in a homicide case, for instance, only be referred to as the decedent or by their name, but not as the victim. And as the judge explained in court, the reason why is that oftentimes the trial is to determine whether or not there is a victim in the case. And this is in the case of Mr. Rittenhouse, who's alleging self-defense. So he doesn't say, I didn't kill so-and-so, these two men, and injure a third. He says, I did kill them, and I had legal justification for doing so. So whether or not that person is a victim is, in fact, an item for the jury or the trier of fact to decide. Not just go about in the courtroom kind of assuming that it is. Now,
so presumably the judge is saying that because the language would be considered prejudicial towards the jury's interpretation of the fact if someone were denoted as a victim rather than an assailant in the case.
Because it could prejudice the defendant's right to a fair trial because of that. That's exactly right, Mark. Now, the detail that has been omitted from, I think, just about every legacy and major media report I have seen on this is that this is the judge's policy in every case in his courtroom, not just Kyle Rittenhouse's case, and not just when it's a white defendant, for instance, which is another thing that's been alleged, and not by, like sort of far off corners of the internet that are dark and scary, but the mainstream big box media, cable news people have these experts on that are laying out this idea that it's somehow unfair because the judge is treating Mr. Rittenhouse this way, when we know that's just not true. And guess what? Who do you think most of the people are on the criminal docket in his courtroom in terms of race and ethnicity? Do you think it benefits, young white kids with massive kind of public support for their cases, or, often poor black and brown ones who have public defenders? So it's not only not the truth, it's the opposite of the truth. It's quite troubling.
So this seems to me, and obviously I'm not a legal mind at all, but this seems to me quite a fair practice, whereas you're not putting forward something that would be prejudicial to a fair trial during the trial. Now, why isn't this the case in most courts if judges are permitted or encouraged or discouraged for actually doing this themselves?
It's an excellent question. I don't know the answer to it. When I heard Judge Schrader's reasoning for it, it was like click, click, click. Yes, makes 1,000% sense. I don't understand why these progressives who want to see Kyle Rittenhouse burn, by the way, this has sort of become one of the many additional proxy wars in the progressive versus right war in this country. They want to see him burn. They should be championing this and making it one of the It would really cost nothing to implement this change. It's not like giving people free college or something like that. If you care for the rights of the accused in a criminal justice system you say is stacked against them, this would go some way towards fixing it. It's a simple thing, but I have to say it just seems like ideology is trumping reason here.
It's an easy and cheap win, I guess. If the prosecution can't say the word victim, why can the defense say arsonist or looter?
So the defense, the prosecution basically put forth this argument that, well, if I can't claim these people are victims, that again, the two people that Mr. Rittenhouse killed and the one person that he shot and injured, if they're not victims, why can the defense disparage them by calling them arsonists and looters, for instance? Well, there's two things. Number one, Mr. Rittenhouse is on trial. He has the right to a fair trial. The other three people are not on trial, and they don't have the right to be depicted in any certain and particular way. This is about Mr. Rittenhouse and his legal culpability. It's remember here that the state of Wisconsin wants to put him away for over 100 years.
170 years, is it?
Yeah, there you go. So that's item number one. Item number two is the judge only said that they can do it if they establish it. So you can't just call somebody an arson unless you're going to introduce some evidence that they are, in fact, an arsonist. And that's presumably what the defense plans to do. It doesn't seem like it's that high a burden for at least one of the persons that Mr. Rittenhouse shot. The other two, well, they weren't there as journalists. I'll tell you that.
Now, Scott, there's a case I'd like to touch on that's a big Fourth Amendment issue here, which I know is one of your favorites, and it's out of Mississippi. Care to give us the details?
You probably don't appreciate this quite as much as a person who doesn't reside in the United States, but the police here will do anything to try to get access to certain people's automobiles and search through them.
Just to clarify here, automobiles are protected by the same Fourth Amendment that protects the home, correct?
That's so that's a separate show in its entirety. You have many fewer rights outside. You're most protected in the United States legally from search and seizure in your home. Once you get in the car and you're on the taxpayers' roads, things get a little bit tricky. And so you do still have some rights, though, and you can't be searched except for if there's a warrant or a exception to the warrant requirement. Basically, the shorter answer I should have given was just that the number of exceptions to the warrant requirement are greater with respect to dealing with cars rather than with a person's abode.
So what happened in Mississippi?
Detective Josh Hartfeld saw somebody driving down the road, pulled them over, and noticed a plastic bag on the floor of their car. And he used that plastic bag as justification for a search. So basically what he said was, because the person had an empty plastic bag, in my training and experience, I think that's typical with drug sellers and drug users, and I was legally allowed to search the man in his car because I saw that plastic bag. Now, the bag did not have anything indicated in it that indicated it was used for drugs. Didn't have, it wasn't like a tiny bag that maybe looked like it had cocaine in it or marijuana or something like that. It was just an empty plastic bag. But yet the police still say that gives them the right to search someone. And if you think about the violation of personhood that's involved in a search just for the presence of an empty sandwich bag, how many cars in America have an empty sandwich bag in them? I can tell you what, if you're a parent, probably 90+% of them do, okay?
Mine certainly does.
Mine as well.
So the judge ruled that this violated the Fourth Amendment. Now, again, I'll ask, what are the ramifications here? Now that we've had a district judge in Mississippi say that a plastic bag, for example, does this just cover a specific plastic bag when it comes up as a citation,
right.
as a law case?
So what you're doing is you're kind of thinking about this in the context of a qualified immunity argument, and that's, I appreciate that, but this is a federal court judge in Mississippi, and I think just what it does, Mark, is it simply dials back the level at which it's sort of like a wave or tide in terms of the line of where things are with the Fourth Amendment. And this just pushes it back sort of more in the field of granting more personal freedom by saying we're not going to go ahead and just willy-nilly agree that the police, can search whatever they want because they can have some extremely tenuous connection to something illegal. So yes, plastic bags are very often used to carry drugs, but the idea that means they're mostly used to carry drugs, or it's likely that you would find drugs simply because you have a plastic bag is, of course, preposterous. And that's what the court said.
Costco, the big cartel outlet, dishing out all those plastic bags. They should better watch out for Fourth Amendment violations, I'm sure.
Hey, I'm a member of that fine one.
It's a fine establishment. Scott T. Cosenza, thank you ever so much.
Cheers. Thank you, Mark.
And that's about it for this week's episode of Liberty Nation Radio. I want to thank our guests, Tim Donner, Andrew Moran, and Jeff Charles. And as ever, our Talking Liberty star, Scott D. Cosenza, for taking the time to join us. And I want to thank you, the listeners coast to coast, for being here. It's your engagement that makes it all worthwhile. And don't forget the words of Margaret Thatcher, who said, "The problem with socialism is that you eventually run out of other people's money." At some point, these massive tax grabs, the social programs, the pork-filled spending bills, eventually, they'll run dry because that's what governments do. And then, like hungry wolves, they'll turn once more back to you for yet another pound of flesh.